August 4th, 1944. For 761 days, Anne Frank had survived in silence behind a hidden bookcase in Amsterdam. She had written dreams into a diary while the Nazis hunted people like her in the streets below. Just 3 days before, she had written her final entry, not knowing it would be her last. "I want to go on living even after my death," she had once written. That morning, footsteps entered the building. A man with a gun climbed the stairs. The bookcase was pulled open, and Anne Frank's final journey began. Most people know Anne Frank through her diary. They know the girl who found beauty in a single patch of sky visible from her attic window, the girl who fell in love, fought with her mother, dreamed of becoming a writer, and somehow maintained hope while the world outside descended into organized slaughter. But the diary ends on August 1st, 1944, 3 days before the raid. What happened after the last page, the 7 months between her arrest and her death, is a story far fewer people know. It is not a story of hope. It is a story of cattle cars, shaved heads, starvation, and disease. It is the story of how a system built on hatred methodically destroyed a 15-year-old girl. This is the story of Anne Frank's final months, and we owe it to her to tell it. August 1st, 1944 was a Tuesday, a hot one. Anne Frank sat in the cramped rooms of the Secret Annex, the hidden apartment behind her father's office at Prinsengracht 263 in Amsterdam, and dipped her pen in ink for what would be the last time. She didn't know that, of course. To her, it was just another day, another entry, another attempt to make sense of the world and of herself. She had been doing this for over 2 years. Since June 1942, when her family first went into hiding, the diary had been her closest companion. She had written about the war, about the Allied advances, about the BBC broadcasts she and the other residents huddled around in the evenings, their only window into a world that was slowly turning against Hitler. She had written about the D-Day landings in June 1944, her words electric with the hope that liberation was close. She had written about falling in love with Peter van Pels, the teenage son of the family who shared the annex with the Franks. She had written about hating her mother and then feeling guilty about it, about worshipping her father, about wanting desperately to be taken seriously as a writer, as a thinker, as a person. In this final entry, though, she writes not of the war outside, but of the war within herself. She describes being a bundle of contradictions. There is the Anne the world sees, cheerful, joking, performing. And then there is the Anne she keeps hidden, the purer, deeper version of herself that she can never quite let out. She is 15 years old, grappling with her identity in the way all 15-year-olds do, except that she is doing it in a space smaller than most apartments, unable to move freely, unable to speak above a whisper during the day, unable to go outside at all. 8 people shared that space. Otto Frank, Anne's father, the calm, dignified center of the annex. Edith Frank, her mother. Margot Frank, her older sister, serious and studious. Herman and August van Pels and their son Peter. And Fritz Pfeffer, a dentist who shared Anne's room and with whom she had a complicated relationship. Life in the annex operated on rigid, survival-driven rules. From the moment the warehouse workers arrived in the morning until they left in the evening, the residents had to move in near total silence. No running water, no flushing toilets during work hours, no raised voices, no running, no normal sounds of life. They read, they studied, they listened to the radio, they waited. 3 days after Anne's final diary entry, the waiting ended. The morning of August 4th, 1944 began normally. In the annex, the residents went through their quiet routines, breakfast, reading, the careful, practiced stillness of people who had been hiding for more than 2 years. In the warehouse and offices below, the business of Otto Frank's company continued. His helpers, the people who had been sustaining the hidden residents with food, news, and companionship for over 2 years, moved through their workday. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, a car stopped outside Prinsengracht 263. Out stepped SS Hauptscharführer Karl Silberbauer, an Austrian officer attached to the German security police, along with several Dutch members of the security service. They were not searching. They were not guessing. They walked into the building and went directly to the right floor, confronted one of the helpers, Victor Kugler, at gunpoint, and demanded to be taken to the hidden entrance. Someone had told them exactly where to go. The question of who betrayed the annex has haunted historians for 80 years. It is one of the most painful, unsolved mysteries of the Second World War. Dozens of theories have been proposed over the decades: former employees, warehouse workers, neighbors, anonymous tipsters. In 2022, a cold case investigation, a team that included retired FBI agent Vince Pankoke and a group of historians and investigators, put forward their most likely suspect, Arnold van den Berg, a prominent Jewish notary in Amsterdam. The theory holds that van den Berg, himself under pressure from the Nazi occupiers, may have passed information about Jewish hiding places, including the annex, to the authorities in exchange for some degree of protection for his own family. The primary evidence was an anonymous note sent to Otto Frank after the war, which named van den Berg. It is important to say clearly, this theory is contested. The NIOD Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, one of the most respected Holocaust research institutions in the world, criticized the investigation's conclusions as insufficiently supported by evidence. The Anne Frank house in Amsterdam has also treated the findings with caution. Arnold van den Berg cannot defend himself. The case against him is circumstantial. What is not in doubt is this: someone made a decision, or a phone call, or passed a piece of paper, and 8 people in hiding were handed to the people who wanted to kill them. Back in the annex, Kugler led Silberbauer to the bookcase. It swung open. Otto Frank would later recall being upstairs with Peter van Pels, going over schoolwork, a domestic, ordinary scene, when the door flew open and a man stood in the doorway with a pistol. Downstairs, the others were rounded up at gunpoint. Silberbauer collected their valuables. In a moment of casual, bureaucratic cruelty, he swept Anne's briefcase, stuffed with her diary papers, her notebooks, her most private self, onto the floor to make room for jewelry and silver. She watched it happen. The raid took 2 hours. When it was over, all 8 residents of the secret annex were under arrest, along with 2 of their helpers, Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman. They were loaded into a vehicle. The door of the annex closed behind them for the last time. Anne Frank would never see it again. Their first stop was not Auschwitz, it was Westerbork. Camp Westerbork was a transit camp in the remote northeastern corner of the Netherlands, originally built by the Dutch government in 1939 to house Jewish refugees fleeing Germany. Under Nazi occupation, it had become something else entirely: a processing point, a sorting facility, a place where Dutch Jews were gathered before being shipped east to the extermination camps. On August 8, 1944, 4 days after their arrest, the 8 people from the secret annex were put on a passenger train, a detail that feels bitterly ironic in retrospect, and transported to Westerbork. Anne already knew what the camp was. 2 years earlier, she had written in her diary about Jews being taken there in cattle cars. She had written, with a teenager's mixture of horror and disbelief, that she believed many of them were being murdered. She had been right. Because they had been caught hiding, which classified them as criminals under Nazi law, they were assigned to the punishment barracks. This distinction mattered. Regular internees at Westerbork had some limited freedoms. Punishment barracks prisoners worked. Anne, Margot, and their mother Edith were assigned to dismantle used batteries. It was filthy, physically grueling work. The battery acid corroded their hands. The work was designed not to produce anything useful, but to exhaust and humiliate. Each day followed the same pattern: exhaustion, inadequate food, and the knowledge that every Tuesday a train left Westerbork heading east. And yet, survivors who were at Westerbork during these weeks would later describe Anne during this period as still recognizably herself: animated, curious, talking with other prisoners. Families had not yet been separated. They could still wear their own clothes. The horror was real, but it was not yet total. On that morning, the transport list for the week's Tuesday deportation was read out. All 8 names from the secret annex were on it. In a tragic twist of timing, This was the very last transport that would ever leave Westerbork bound for Auschwitz. The Allied forces were advancing rapidly. Within weeks, the deportations would stop entirely. If the annex had not been raided when it was, if the betrayal had come just a month later, or not at all, the story might have ended differently. They came so close. There was no passenger train this time. They were loaded into cattle cars. More than 1,000 people forced into dark, sealed wagons. No seats, no windows. A single bucket in the corner for sanitation, for over 1,000 people, for a journey that would take 3 days. The doors were bolted from the outside. Think about what those 3 days meant for Anne Frank. She had spent 761 days in the Secret Annex. Confined, yes, but in a space with beds, books, a radio, windows, people who loved her. This was something categorically different. The heat, the darkness, the smell, the crush of bodies with nowhere to sit, the moaning of the sick and the elderly, the crying of children, no food, almost no water, the wheels on the track, grinding east. On September 5th, 1944, the doors were unbolted. Blinding lights, shouting, dogs barking. The chaos of the arrival platform at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The selection began immediately. SS doctors moved along the platform, directing prisoners left or right with gestures so casual they seemed almost bored. Women and children were separated from the men. In the noise and the confusion, Otto Frank was pulled away from his wife and daughters. He looked back at them across the platform. It was the last time he would ever see them. Of the 1,019 people on that transport, 549 were sent directly to the gas chambers that night, including every child under the age of 15. Anne Frank had turned 15 in June, just 3 months earlier. She survived the selection by a margin of weeks. Surviving the selection meant entering Auschwitz. For many, it only prolonged the inevitable. The processing of new arrivals was designed with one purpose: to strip away every marker of individual identity. They were ordered to undress. Their heads were shaved. A number was tattooed on the forearm. Anne's number has never been confirmed as the records were largely destroyed, but the tattooing of all new arrivals was standard and systematic. She was no longer Anne Frank. She was a number in a ledger. The women's camp at Birkenau was a place of organized deprivation. Hundreds of prisoners were packed into wooden barracks built for far fewer, sleeping on 3-tiered bunks with thin straw mattresses and a single shared blanket. The daily food ration was a bowl of watery soup, often made from rotting vegetables, and a small piece of bread. It was a starvation diet, calibrated to keep prisoners alive long enough to work. Anne was assigned to a labor detail hauling heavy stones. Her body, already weakened by the journey, strained under the work. She developed scabies, a skin infestation caused by parasitic mites that burrow under the skin, causing maddening, relentless itching. In the conditions of Birkenau, treatment was essentially non-existent. From the barracks, the chimneys of the crematoria were visible on the horizon. The smell was constant. The prisoners knew what it meant. This knowledge, the physical, undeniable proximity to industrial mass murder, was itself a form of psychological torture. Edith Frank, in these weeks, became ferocious in her determination to keep her daughters alive. She would save portions of her own already inadequate rations and find ways to pass bread to Anne and Margot through gaps in the fencing when they were held in an adjacent section. She was growing skeletal, but her maternal will did not falter. One of the few direct testimonies we have of Anne during the Auschwitz period comes from a Dutch woman, Ronnie Goldstein van Cleef, who was in the same barracks. She remembered Anne as still responsive, still present, but already diminishing. The light was going out slowly. In late October 1944, with the Soviet army advancing from the east, the SS began selecting prisoners for evacuation to camps deeper inside the Reich. Anne and Margot were chosen for transfer. Their mother was not. Edith Frank stood and watched her daughters marched away. She never recovered from it. On January 6, 1945, Edith Frank died in Auschwitz, alone, from starvation and exhaustion. She was 44 years old. She had given her food to her children until there was nothing left of herself to give. In late October or early November 1944, the exact date is not recorded, Anne and Margot Frank arrived at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in the Lüneburg Heath of northern Germany. Bergen-Belsen had not been designed as an extermination camp. There were no gas chambers here, no industrial killing apparatus. It had been built as a prisoner of war camp, then converted to hold concentration camp prisoners deemed potentially useful as exchange hostages. For a time, conditions had been marginally less catastrophic than at Auschwitz. By the time Anne and Margot arrived, that was no longer true. As the Allied armies advanced from the west and the Soviet army from the east, the Nazis began force-marching prisoners from camps closer to the front lines toward camps deeper in Germany. Bergen-Belsen, built to hold a few thousand people, was receiving tens of thousands. The infrastructure, never adequate, simply collapsed. The food supply broke down, the water supply broke down. The sanitation system, such as it was, ceased to function. When Anne and Margot first arrived, they were housed in large tents. Then, a massive winter storm struck, destroying the tents entirely. The sisters were moved into the barracks, already grotesquely overcrowded, already thick with disease. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was one of the coldest in decades. Inside the unheated barracks of Bergen-Belsen, prisoners lay on filthy, lice-ridden bunks in whatever clothing they still possessed. There was almost no food, there was almost no clean water, and threading through the camp like a death sentence written in invisible ink was typhus. Typhus is a bacterial infection transmitted by body lice. In normal circumstances, it is serious but treatable. In Bergen-Belsen in the winter of 1944, in a population of starving, freezing, exhausted human beings packed together without sanitation or medicine, it was a death sentence for tens of thousands. The symptoms progress with merciless efficiency: high fever, severe headaches, a rash across the chest and abdomen, and then, as the disease advances, delirium. The infected person loses coherence. They lose the ability to care for themselves. In the conditions of the camp, they lose the will to live. An estimated 50,000 people died in Bergen-Belsen. The majority died of typhus or starvation, or both simultaneously. Among them were Anne and Margot Frank. We have two witnesses whose testimony allows us to see Anne in her final weeks. The first is Hannah Pick-Goslar, one of Anne's closest childhood friends, who was also imprisoned in Bergen-Belsen in a separate section. Hannah had heard that Anne was in the camp, and she made her way to the barbed wire fence that divided their sections. What she found was devastating. Anne came to the fence, but the girl Hannah saw was not the Anne she had known. She was skeletal, her head was shaved, she was shivering, wrapped in what Hannah described as little more than a thin blanket. She wept. She told Hannah she believed her father was dead. Otto Frank was, in fact, alive in Auschwitz, but Anne had no way of knowing this. She said she had nothing left. Her spirit, Hannah later recalled, seemed already broken. Hannah managed to throw a small package of food over the fence. It was taken by another prisoner before Anne could reach it. She was able to get a second package to her. It was the last contact between them. The second witness is Jannie Brandes Brieleslijper, a Dutch resistance member who was imprisoned in the same barracks as Anne and Margot. She later described watching as typhus took hold of both sisters. Anne, she recalled, became increasingly delirious. At one point, in the fever and confusion of her illness, Anne tore off her own clothes because they were so infested with lice she could no longer bear them. She stood shivering, unable to help herself. This is the detail that, perhaps more than any other, captures the full horror of what was done to her. The girl who had written about beauty and love and the goodness she still believed existed in people was dying half naked and delirious in a frozen barracks, while the people who had built this system waited for her to stop existing. Margot died first. The exact date is unknown, but it was most likely in late February 1945. She was 19 years old. Jannie Brandes Brieleslijper witnessed what happened. In her final hours, too weak to hold herself upright, Margot fell from her bunk to the stone floor below. The fall, in her condition, was unsurvivable. She died where she fell. For Anne, Margot's death was the end of whatever remained. They had shared everything: childhood, the annex, the cattle car, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen. Margot had been the fixed point in 2 years of disintegration. Survivors later said that after Margot died, Anne seemed to simply stop fighting. She had nothing left to hold on to. Within days, the accounts vary on exactly how many, Anne Frank also died. She was 15 years old. For decades, her death was recorded as March 1945. More recent research by the Anne Frank House, based on a careful re-examination of survivor testimonies and transport records, now places her death in late February 1945, likely within days of Margot's. There was no burial, there was no grave. Their bodies, like tens of thousands of others, were thrown into one of the mass pits dug around the camp. The exact location is unknown. On April 15, 1945, at most a few weeks after Anne died, possibly less, British troops entered Bergen-Belsen. They found 13,000 unburied corpses. They found 60,000 survivors in states of such extreme illness and starvation that thousands more would die in the weeks following liberation. They filmed what they found because they understood that the world would need to see it to believe it. Anne Frank was not there to be liberated. She had died, probably, with liberation less than a month away.